part of our evening, organized, as I said earlier, in cooperation with Fondation Braillard, and I'm very grateful to you for facilitating this premiere. My name is Shalini Randeria. I forgot to introduce myself, so somebody asked me if I usually was around this place, so maybe I should say that I am. I am director of the newly established Albert Hirschman Center for Democracy. I'm a professor of anthropology and sociology here at the Institute, and I am co-hosting this event. It's a great pleasure to have you with us, Professor Georges Prevelakis. He has had a very distinguished career after having left Athens, where he was in a first incarnation. So he has had sort of two lives. In a first incarnation, he was an architect and an urban planner before he turned to matters of geopolitics. In the latter incarnation, we have seen him teaching and researching in Paris, in Boston, in London, and in Baltimore. And the talk today, I think, is going to combine your two lives. And this is going to be a great challenge for you and fun for us. He's a professor of geopolitics at the Pantheon-Sorbonne in Paris, and associate fellow at the Sciences Po Center for International Research, CERI. He specializes in Europe, but also on the Balkans in particular, and Eastern Mediterranean regionally, and the theme of geopolitics is something which sort of goes through his entire work. Cultural geography, urban planning, architecture, but also the diaspora has been a constant theme in your research and writing. And from 2003 to 2005, he served as the Konstantin Karamanlis Chair in Hellenic and Southeast Asian European Studies at the Fletcher School. But he was also in diplomacy, as I learned when I looked at your vita from 2013 to 2015. He was the Greek ambassador to the OECD. He's a regular contributor to Greek and to international media, with a large number of publications to his credit, the most recent of which is on Greek identity in crises, and links it to the theme of geopolitics, which is what we're going to hear something about today, but in connection with the idea of urban space, of urbanity. So from what I could gather of your work, if I could just make 2 points and then give you the word, you do stand for me in the tradition of the French geographical school on the one hand, and also I noticed sort of echoes of Toynbee and also sometimes Huntington on the other hand. So it's an interesting combination of intellectual theories and perspectives which you bring to bear on the question of Hellenism and Hellenic civilization. And of course, we are in a very long temporal perspective here that you are going to sketch today, looking at, and this was an interesting point for me also in the discussion earlier today, looking at the nation state as a problem in the Greek case. Yeah. And that your argument has been, if I understand you correctly, that the price which Greece has paid for becoming a modern nation state is particularly heavy because it has meant abandoning many of the features, core features of what would be Hellenic culture. And you think this is a good moment, the crises, where there is general national pessimism, to come back to some kind of optimism with regard to one's roots, one's collective roots, and to be able to draw on them in order not only to rethink identity, but to rethink the concept of territoriality as a whole. So I hope I've not misled any of you. Exactly. But it was a very, very interesting set of readings for me, because I think it also partly goes against so much of the current trend in arguments on cultural roots of collective identity, on how to think about territoriality and culture, and also about how to conceptualize nation-state identities and the move beyond them, and go back to a larger civilizational frame in thinking about a lot of these issues. So a warm welcome to you, and you have the word. Please feel free to speak for as long as you like, within 3/4 of an hour as you asked, and then we would turn to the audience for a discussion. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. We have had before 2 presentations, which in fact introduced the main issue that I wanted to develop. But as some of you may not have been here, I will first show you a few slides in order to make this point. I hope that I know how. I think I need some help with this. Well, meanwhile, let me say a few words. I'm really very happy to be here, and I'm very happy because of this challenge. The theme, the general framework of this meeting is quite complicated because we speak about public space, about democracy, and public space is interpreted in 2 ways. On the one hand, as democratic space, as political space, but also as physical space. And this brings me back to debates and discussions on the political role of architecture, and also on a fundamental issue in geography, in the theory of geography. The question is physical space, is geographical space influencing the society? Can we influence the society through the use of architecture or urban planning? Or rather the opposite, is space the reflection of social structures, of political structures? This was a big debate. Of course, the traditional Marxist view was that space is a reflection of social structures, and then this means that we don't have much of a role as urban planners. And then we have the opposite, and it's amusing to see that those that defended the opposite position, that we can transform society through architecture, were also Marxists. This was the structuralist school of the Soviet architecture, and they devised this idea that they could create buildings that could function as condensers of social change. It's an old debate, and this is a debate that we encountered in the discussion before. I think that the Greek and the Athens example will help us see that there is no absolute answer to this question. In fact, both sides have part of the truth. There is a dialectic between the voluntarist activity of political actors and of architects that can influence cultural and political structures. And then, of course, cultural and political structures also express themselves through space. I will have the opportunity to give you a few examples about that. So on the one hand, we have, I think, a major theoretical issue in this theme, and this is why I find it fascinating, But then the other issue is Greece and Athens. There is one of the stereotypes, the Eurocentric stereotypes, is to perceive Greece as a nice country, but rather peripheral to the history of Europe. There is a British historian, Mark Mazauer, who underlined the contrary. He said that if you look at European history, Greece is always at the center of major events. And this, of course, is not due to a certain talent of us Greeks, but rather to the importance of the Greek theme for the European history and the European identity. And therefore, looking at Greece, looking at what's happening in Greece, is very important, not only for Greek issues, but also for European and general issues, and sometimes also for larger theoretical issues. So from that point of view, I think that this meeting is interesting, not only for those who are interested in the Greek situation, but for those who try to understand, those of us who try to understand how the world is moving and how the world is rapidly changing, world is evolving. But now my slides are ready. And what I'm trying to show you, I'll try to show you with my slides. I think I'll manage, yeah. Okay. Is in fact the same thing that we saw during the previous presentations. Some of you were here, some were not. The very complex and contradictory situation of urban landscape in Greece and in Athens. So here you have the most spectacular realization, recent realization in Athens, which is the Niarchos Cultural Center. And you see that I selected this image because it shows an open space, a public space. President Macron was in Athens, and of course the Greek government wanted to show this building for which the Greek government is very, very proud. So it's a showpiece of Greece. This is one image. This is another image of public space in a small island, in the Poros Island, which is very well known for its tourism. But if you walk upstairs, then you find yourself in another world, in a world where public and private space are intermixed, and where the inhabitants are able to maintain it at a very high level of quality. This is because, as we saw in the presentations, public space, this is not, okay, I will change a bit the series of my slides. Public space in Athens is very badly maintained. It's in a very bad state. And the Greek state very often spends a lot of money, or the Greek municipality spend a lot of money to create public spaces, and then in a year or two, you see them becoming destroyed. They are dirty, occupied by situations like this. We can find worse. I didn't have a lot of time to select pictures. So you have this contrast between public space, which belongs to the inhabitants, to the neighborhood, and then public space which is publicly managed and very badly maintained. But I'll return to the other pictures. You have, this is the Acropolis Museum, again, a monument of great pride for the Greek state, a way to say how proud we are for our heritage, and to show the reasons for which we have to oblige the British to return the Elgin marbles. And at the same time, you have, you have those neoclassical monuments, I will come back to them, which have been filled with slogans. Okay, that's not too bad. The thing is that the slogans remain for years and years. The Greek state is unable or unwilling to erase them. And these slogans have been accompanied by expressions of hostility hostility. You see, here this is the main square in Athens, opposite to the university, and they have written, this is an ugly city that burns beautifully. It shows a hostility. And we have to understand why this hostility. We have to find a cultural explanation. It's not an issue of saying this is very good or this is very bad. We have to understand why. What are the reasons? What does this mean? And what can we learn from this kind of hostility? Sorry. Also the same thing is valid about the architectural heritage, which is falling apart. There was an article recently in The Guardian exactly on this issue. The whole treasures of Greek architecture in Athens, a large part of it has been destroyed during the construction during the 50s and the 60s, but now it is falling apart. And the state does not make the slightest effort to protect it. And then, of course, we have public spaces for tourists and for tourism. We have examples. This is an example of the university where students have written slogans, and those slogans are permanent. But this kind of political use of public space is not limited to the students or to the forces, let's say, of the left, because here you have a demonstration of policemen. And of course, Athens has become a paradise for graffiti art. And those things coexist. Here you have a church, which used to be the focus of public space in traditional Greece, because usually public space is the church and then the square opening to the church. So you have the church. You have a pedestrian space that has been created recently following the fashions of architecture of the last decades. And then you have graffitis, everything mixed up. And finally, again, I return to our president. I say our president because I happen to have both nationalities. The asset of Athens is its symbolic value. And this Macron has understood very well and has tried to recuperate it. So in Athens, there are treasures of international importance that are not material, they are symbolic, but they are very important. So you see, we have many faces of Athens. I would like to turn it off because I don't think you want to see Macron constantly. There are many faces and many contradictory faces. And of course, this leads to confusion. We have difficulty to understand what's happening. This confusion on the level of the landscape is parallel to the feeling of confusion that exists today in the Greek society. The Greeks do not know who they are, where they are going, and of course they are very much depressed because this crisis has made them feel that they are not worthy of the European identity or whatever else. So we need somehow to understand what is behind this confusion. And I believe that the historical approach is very useful. So I will try not to make a history of Greece or of Athens, etc., but try to show certain moments in this history and relate them to the question of public space or of landscape or of architecture. I have published things on Greece. I have recently published a book which is called, it's in French, Qui sont les Grecs, une identité en crise? Who are the Greeks? An identity in crisis. And these are the results of my efforts during all those years of teaching in France to explain and to analyze the Greek situation. And I have always felt that my main problem of pedagogy was not to give the information, but to have people get rid of the information. Because there are stereotypes that create a kind of a wall, and this makes it very difficult to explain what is the reality. And the main stereotype, I hope I will not shock anybody, is that there has been a Greek nation before the creation of the Greek state, and that suddenly, with the revolution, this nation managed to create its state, and therefore that before the revolution it was a kind of an abnormal situation that became normal with the creation of the Greek state. This is not, it's not true in the sense that it is an anachronism. In fact, during the Ottoman Empire, there were religious communities. One of the religious communities, one major, was the Orthodox community, what they called the Rum. And out of this religious community emerged the Greeks, but not only the Greeks, but also the Bulgarians, the Serbs, the Romanians, etc. So what happened was a kind of mutation of identity. A religious identity mutated into a national identity, and this mutation was the result of Western influence. Now, the Greek case is more interesting than the other cases. Why? Because of the Greek theme. Because the Europeans, moving towards their own modernity, had to legitimate this change. And the way they found to legitimate it was the reference to ancient Greece. They used a historical utopia in order to make a major break in their own history. And therefore, the reference to Greece was very important to them. And this is why the Europeans invested. This major theme of Philhellenism, and we are in a main focus of Philhellenism here in Geneva, because NR was one of the major supporters of the Greek Revolution. This theme of Philhellenism, I had the opportunity to make a lecture here in Geneva about this some years ago. It was not a kind of a philanthropy. It was not for the interest of the Greeks that those Philhellenes went to Greece and many of them died there. It was because they were fighting for their own European identity interests. So this is why the Greek identity has been a pioneer in this transformation, in this mutation of the Rum religious identity into national identities. So you have to get rid of this idea of a nation waking up and understand that this change was a very radical change. It was a radical change because people had to change their own identity, what they believed. They had to abandon the faiths of their fathers and their mothers and their grandfathers on the one hand. But then for us geographers, there is another change. The Ottoman territory was an imperial territory, which functioned with networks. And it had to be transformed into a Western territory according to the Westphalian logic. Clear-cut frontiers, a center, centralization, something very, very different. So this created enormous stresses in the Greek society. Now, if we move to space, in the Ottoman Empire, public space and private space, first of all, the distinction was not clear-cut. And then there is an analysis by one geographer who doesn't live anymore, who was a Greek of Turkish origin, I mean a Greek from Istanbul, Stefan Gerasimos, who knew very well the Turkish society and the Turkish tradition. He says, and I found that extremely interesting, he says, in the Ottoman Empire there were two law traditions. There was the Sharia and then the Urf, I think I pronounced it correctly. It was a struggle between the state and the community. So the state was trying to create public space, big roads, squares, etc. And then there was the community, which based on the Sharia, which struggled against it. And this struggle usually ended with the victory of the community. And this is why we do not have large spaces, squares, avenues, etc. in the Ottoman city. We have this kind of maze, this kind of organic, complicated city, which expresses the interests of the community. The other reason is that you can defend yourself against the state much better if you are in such a maze. So there is this struggle between a power that in the Ottoman tradition is felt as something outside the society. It's a major difference with Western societies. In the Western societies, the society and the state are close. You feel that the state belongs to you. In our Ottoman tradition, we feel that the state is something outside us, threatening, and also so powerful and so wealthy that we can take profit of it without really making any damage. We have different political cultures. We have therefore this kind of balance, which in the Ottoman framework is in favor of the community, not forever. During the 19th century, the Ottomans start a series of reforms, and they will change their cities as well. But not as radically as the Greeks, because in Greece, the introduction of the Western model is made in a very clear-cut and radical way, and it is operated not by the Greeks themselves, but by the Germans, the Bavarians. And there is an illustration by a famous Greek urban planner, whom I think some of us admire a lot, Constantine Doxiadis, in his book about Athens. You see, he has the old Athens, Ottoman Athens, and then the new Athens that has been created. There are two realities that have nothing to do. In the one case, there is no public space. In the other, it's structured by public spaces. We have two completely different realities. Does this mean that Greece becomes European and Western? No. No, it's not possible. There's going to be a double system, a dual system. There's going to be a duality for a very long time. Until today. But today, I'll try to show that things have become more complicated. It's not simply dual. But this duality was geographically separated. There was, on the one hand, there was the city, the capital, in which the European system and the public spaces were imposed, and where we were talking about the role of architecture, where architecture was playing a major symbolic role in order to introduce the nationalist ideal. Neoclassicism, if we look at neoclassicism through the eyes of the Bauhaus, of Le Corbusier, etc., the idea was that this was something that belonged to the past, more or less reactionary. At that time, neoclassicism was the most radical expression of modernity and of change and of westernization. So those buildings were a major instrument for the political change of the Greek society. This is why I was saying that sometimes architecture and urban planning can change social structures, not simply reflect social structures. This is a first stage, and it will last for quite a series of decades. Then there's going to be a second wave. And this second wave, in this second wave, the pioneer is not going to be Greece. The pioneer is going to be Turkey. And this is also a comment I would like to make, that, you know, Greeks and Turks in urban planning and in other fields, we are looking towards France, towards England, both of us looking outside. and we fail to look on the other side of the Aegean. If we do it, then we find out that we have lots of similarities, and I will come back to that. So the second wave was with modernism in the architectural sense. The Bauhaus, Le Corbusier. Again, we have a Western model which comes to our cities and which promotes also public spaces in the Western sense, even more radically. And therefore we have cases like the urban planning of Salonika. Now it's not only Athens, it's also Salonika. Much of Salonika has been destroyed by the big fire. And this gave the opportunity to create large-scale public spaces. And the same thing happens in Izmir, where again there has been, you see a series of coincidences. The big fire at the end of the Greek-Turkish war. And again, we have urban planning. And in both cases, we have international fairs. We have this kind of introduction of the Western model of public spaces in those societies. And it works up to a certain degree. It works in certain fields. There are other fields in which the Ottoman traditions survive. In the villages, we have this village life with the village square, the church, the village square, and the people meet. And there is no clear-cut distinction between public and private. There is also a gender issue. These public spaces are for the men, the women less. The women have another field. They are in the house, and then they go and sit outside the house, and they will discuss among themselves on the staircase. So the small street becomes a kind of a semi-private, semi-public space. We have this duality. Things will change again in the 50s when there's going to be a rapid urbanization. The village will come into the city. And then the Ottoman tradition towards space will come to the city, will invade the city. And then we'll find those two ways of constructing urban space that have been mentioned before. The one is the legal housing, and the other is the antiparochi, which are inventions that had nothing to do with urban planners. I have been an urban planner, and I have shared the frustration of urban planners because we were making plans that nobody implemented, and then the city was growing outside our control. Spontaneous illegal housing has the equivalent in the gecekondu in Turkey, exactly the same thing. And there is the equivalent, the exact equivalent of antiparochi. I forget the word, but there is a word also. They did exactly the same thing, exactly the same thing. Why? Because it is the way, the traditional way of creating, of solving the problems of the city, of solving the problems of housing. At that time, we were all furious. I criticize myself. We were all furious because we were saying, what is this? Illegal housing. The city grows without any control. It's going to create enormous problems of circulation. And then the antiparochi is a kind of a speculation. It creates profits. All this is illegal. What is this? We wanted the nice Western model of the charte d'Athènes, of the Athens Charter. What do we find out today? We find out that those illegal housing neighborhoods have become wonderful neighborhoods, continuing the old tradition of the mahalle, of the Ottoman neighborhood, and it's nice living spaces. We found out that the antiparochi that created very high densities, which we were criticizing strongly, has created now an environment of ecologically efficient city, and I was very happy to listen that this is understood now, that this is nice to have high densities, and of course it is very urgent to save those neighborhoods because they are threatened by decay. So those two realities got together in the city. But this did not create any kind of big problems. Somehow this coexistence of the old and the new, of the Eastern and the Western, of the Ottoman and the Westphalian, somehow it functioned. Well, it functioned during a period that was stable, the Cold War, stability, and prosperous. And then, especially for Greece, there have been the wonderful decades of prosperity and easy money since the entrance of Greece into the European Union. So the tensions, the stresses, the contradictions were covered under prosperity. But of course it was a false prosperity, and it was a prosperity that was based on the exaggeration of one structural element of Greek history, which was and is now less rent-seeking. Rent-seeking. One of the secrets of the Greek success is that Greece could benefit from the help of the West, could obtain rent from the West for two reasons. The one is geopolitics, geostrategy, a very important position. Everybody wanted to have Greece on its side, and everybody was ready to give a bit of money in order to have bases in Greece, etc. In this, Turkey is similar. But then there is a second origin of rent, which is symbolism, symbolic. Macron, who came to PNIX, he had to pay something for that. It was not free. It was not free, and he did pay it through support to the Greek government. It's obvious that there has been a kind of an exchange. Okay, we will let you speak on the PNIX, but then you must say a few nice words about what we are doing here in Greece as a government. This has been going on since the 19th century. So we have two kinds of rent all through the history of the Greek history. This is at the same time a problem and an asset. It would be long to discuss it. The thing is that during the 3 decades during which Greece is in the European Union, this has been strongly exaggerated. The quantity of rent that has come into Greece during those 3 decades was enormous. And therefore, all the equilibria that had been created through this history have been destroyed. And this is the reason for which, when the rent could not continue because of the economic crisis, the whole thing collapsed. And thus we come to the last stage, which is the stage of the disruption, all this system, which functioned more or less, which was both East and West, series of compromises, not all of them very nice aesthetically, as westernized intellectuals, we didn't like them. But then you have to have an anthropological point of view. You have to understand that societies somehow manage to survive. We come to the last period. And the last period is characterized by not only the crisis and the end of this model and the system, but an additional element, which is the influence of globalization and the new technologies. Athens is receiving pressures from the outside, enormous pressures from the outside. Pressures because of its tourist attraction. Pressures because it contains symbols and images, and those have become very important in our global era. We are in a world in which images, symbols constitute major assets. Athens has them, other cities as well, and other cities are threatened. And this happens also at a period during which democracy, traditional democracy, the state, based on nationalism have weakened. So the old defenses of the society, good or bad, we can be critical towards nationalism, but at the same time, nationalism was the foundation of a certain type of democracy that created the state which had borders and which could resist and protect to outside forces. Now, with globalization on the one hand, and with the weakening of the state and the nation, Greece and Athens becomes an open field for competing forces. And this, we see it on the landscape of Athens, and it explains certain contradictions that we see now. And I believe that it will be expressed in the future with new phenomena. New phenomena means that space, public space, to return again to the question of public space, but also houses, infrastructure, will be little by little given over to a global cosmopolitan class. It's not difficult to imagine why. It has been mentioned before. We saw that in buildings near the Acropolis, the highest level, while the rest of the building is empty, the highest levels are used. Because why? Why? If you have lived this experience, you know. If you are on a flat, on the top of a flat, and you see Acropolis there, this is breathtaking. And now you can have it now. You can have it for nothing if you're Greek. For nothing. You can have it for free. How long? For how long? There are going to be Chinese, Japanese, Russians who will pay a lot of money to have that. This means, of course, that those areas have to be transformed. So this means probably that we will continue leaving those houses fall down so that their price will be zero, and then they will be taken over. So we have kind of an open city exposed to forces of globalization. And thus, the landscape, in a certain sense, as I say, is a metaphor for the challenges of Greek society. This kind of patchwork that I described, a little from the past, a little for the 19th century, some elements from the mid-war period, and then globalization. This is a patchwork that we say, or if you like, it's a palimpsest. Strata, different strata. Some place we find one time scale, sometimes we find something else. This confused image expresses the confusion of the Greek society. The Greek society is not dual anymore, it is fragmented. There are many fragments in the same way that we have this patchwork of urban space, we have a patchwork of the Greek society. And it is under the pressure of the new forces, of the new global forces. But this does not mean, I don't want to finish with a pessimistic point of view. It is a transition, in the same way that in the beginning of the 19th century, this historical subject that we may call the Greeks, we may call the Rome, we may call the Hellenism, I don't know. It's not very easy because it's vague. In my books, I have tried to convey the idea that it is a residue of a Hellenic civilization. There is a kind of a historical subject that goes back. This historical subject, at a certain moment, had to adapt to a new reality, which was the modern Westphalian territorial state. It was a suit that did not fit very well to it, but there was no other option. And the proof is that other people of similar functioning, like the Jews or the Armenians, that did not adapt fast enough, suffered a lot. Now we're getting into a new era, during which the Westphalian nation state is challenged. The territorial organization will not disappear. It's not the end of the territories, as Badi has written in his book, but we will have various forms of territoriality. One of those forms is going to be the city territoriality, and then an organization in the form of networks. So it's a new era, and Greeks, as the other people, have to rethink their presence on the global scene. On some areas, they will lose. One of the things which becomes clear, the Greeks have not yet realized it, is that in 20 or 30 years, the population of Greece will not be 100% or 90% Greeks. It's going to be 60% Greeks, because a lot of Greeks will leave simply because there is a tradition of diaspora and because Greeks integrate themselves very easily in societies that are thirsty because of the demographic problem for young population. So obviously a lot of Greeks will go to Germany. Germany has a big demographic problem, and the Germans know that if Greeks come, they don't create problems. So Greeks will leave. Europeans, old Europeans will come to Greece to spend their pension years. And then they will need services. So a lot of people from Africa and the Middle East will come to Greece. So this image of a homogeneous, monolithic Greece is finished. And these Greeks have not understood it. When they are going to understand it, it's going to be a shock. But at the same time, Greeks have to understand that their global presence, which has at least three forms today. The one is the diaspora. I belong to the diaspora. Panos belongs to the diaspora. The other is the merchant marine, the biggest merchant marine in the world. And the third, about which very few people talk, is the influence of the Greek church. The Greek church is present in Africa, is present in Asia. It is an extraordinary network of international influence. So we have a kind of a return to pre-modernity in post-modernity. Now, to return to architecture, such an evolution will take what urban forms and what kind of landscapes? Impossible to know. But obviously Athens in 50 years is going to be much different than Athens as it was when we visited it or we lived in it in the 50s and the 60s. Thank you very much.
As a guy of the diaspora to a guy of diaspora, thank you so much, George, for this excellent talk and very clear and very concise, very precise. I hope that our audience enjoyed it and that there are questions raised or remarks or even opposite opinions. If you were in a free democracy still, as far as I know. The more interesting. Is there any first immediate reaction that, sir? Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
Thank you. Well, thank you very much for a very interesting talk. You spoke about hostility as evidenced. You spoke about hostility as evidenced in the graffiti. Whom is the hostility directed against?
Well, of course, you can interpret. It's a question of interpretation. I'll give you my interpretation. What somehow I suspect. On a first level, those are anarchists, left-wing people. I mean, okay. But then I think there is something else. Why do they attack the symbols of 19th century nationalism? Why? Now, the population of this area that became Greece, what were they? It was a very heterogeneous population. In fact, Greece has been created how? After the revolution, after the battle of the naval battle of Navarin, the Russo-Turkish war, the Ottomans had no possibility to resist, and the Westerners came and dictated. They told them, you are going to create an independent state, which for the Ottomans had no meaning. The independent state, they didn't understand it, because the Ottomans knew that you are an empire, you are in a war with another empire, the border moves a bit, or that you give some more autonomy or less autonomy to areas that continue to belong to you. Independent, they didn't understand it, but they had no choice. And then the Westerners said, we will draw a line and define a territory. And I have, in fact, a map. I tried to explain that. How artificial was this territory? I don't know if the... Here it is. In fact, the first Greek territory, it's in black. It's an ellipse. You can include it in an ellipse. And this ellipse has two centers, as all ellipses have two centers. The one is Athens and the other is Sparta. So you see, it's the historical and geographical imagination of the West, an image of the West. What was ancient Greece for the Western mind in the beginning of the 19th century? It was the Peloponnesian Wars, Athens and Sparta. You take those 2 points, we draw an ellipse, this is Greece. Completely artificial, nothing to do with any kind of cultural or geographical realities. So you draw a line, and then you have the content. What do you find in this box that you created? You had Muslims, Orthodox people, Jews, first of all. There has been a first simplification. The Muslims had to go, those that survived. The Jews remained, there were many, many. So it was simplified in the sense that mostly the population was Orthodox. But from the point of view of the language, they spoke Greek, but they also spoke Albanian, and they also spoke Vlach, maybe some Slavs. The language at that time did not have much significance for national identity, but still. But then there were other differences. Some people were people of the mountain, others of the plain, others of the islands. A very, very heterogeneous population. They had to be transformed into a nation in the Western sense. So it was a straitjacket that has been created by the capital, by Athens, by the intellectual institutions. So Greece created this poor country, created the first university, the first academy, and those intellectuals invented what I have called the Homo Hellenicus, what a Greek should be like. And this model had to be applied on those populations. Sometimes this has been done quite violently. So the cultural identities have been repressed. Sometimes this repression was very heavy, especially when it was combined with geopolitical issues. For example, when communism was associated with Slav languages, and people had to change their names. And this kind of pressure, I think, has created a kind of resentment, a deep resentment, that could not find expression because those populations did not have their intellectuals. There were no organic intellectuals of those populations, so they could not express it. And what happened was that it was expressed from time to time in violent ways. So if we look at the civil war, the Greek civil war, which we tend to imagine as the struggle between the nationalists and the communists. If we look, and there have been studies of historians and anthropologists, we understand it has nothing to do with that. It has a lot to do with those Balkan realities. The people were against nationalism, they became communists, but they didn't know anything about the capital. But they had been repressed by this kind, if you like, of national identity. I suspect that these kinds of explosions of hostility are also a kind of resurgence of those kind of repressed feelings of resentment that has to do with nationalism. This is my interpretation, but there can be others as well.
A question.
Thank you for your very insightful presentation. You mentioned new technologies, and some of the skill set of new technologies are networks and symbols. So I was wondering if maybe this could have a positive impact going forward on the Hellenic or Ottoman historical dynamic, and whether maybe for Greeks it could be an opportunity to finish a cycle in some sense. Thank you.
Well, yes, this is valid for all people of diasporas, and this is why diasporas are coming on the surface again. Diasporas during the 19th and the 20th century, especially during the 20th century, were considered as a phenomenon of historical interest and which would disappear. And we see that the diasporas are coming back. They are coming back for a series of reasons. But obviously technology plays a great role because what are diasporas? Diasporas are systems that are able to resist to the to time and space. Time and space, if you have a community and you separate them in space during sufficient time, they are absorbed by the environment, therefore they lose their identity. Now, people with a diasporic tradition, like the Greeks, the Jews, the Armenians, the Indians, the Chinese, somehow have developed a capacity to overcome this kind of, I would say, of geographical entropy. But of course, this is reinforced now because this influence of space is being diminished because of new technologies. And the other thing is that these new technologies can help for a better coordination between, on the one hand, Greeks in Greece and Greeks in diaspora. And we can imagine many forms of cooperation, of working together, of sharing assets, etc. It's, I think that Greeks have this capacity to function in networks, which becomes very important. When I try to explain that to my students, I say, take two students that have the same problem. They want to go to New York. The one is French and the other is Greek. What are they going to do? The French will go to the embassy, to the consulate, to service of information, to a state institution to get the information. Now, what will the Greek do? What the Indian will do? Of course, function through the network. You have two attitudes that are clearly different and show two different ways of functioning with time and space. We spent, during the last 2 centuries, the French way was more successful. In the coming period, the Greek way or the Indian way is going to be more successful. So these are, of course, elements of hope for Greece, but the cultural adaptation of everybody has to be very, is hard. It's not easy because you mentioned my influences, intellectual influences. There is another big and major influence, less known than Toynbee. It's Jean Gottman, who was a great geographer. And one of the things he said is that the borders in the minds are much more rigid than the borders on the land. This is the problem we have to face now, is how to overcome the borders in our minds.
The last question, maybe, or before that.
Yeah, I thought that was fascinating that that your contemporary interpretation that the generations now, the new millenniums, are again under a kind of repression. In fact, they don't see themselves well represented, nor by Tsipras with his new socialist party, nor do they see themselves well represented with the old nationalists. And so I think actually the new generations, the millenniums, are not interested in history anymore. In fact, this heterotopia where we live in is not really caring whether there's an identity, right? Mm-hmm. It's much more pragmatic situation of just being able to live, right, and enjoy and work and have some income, right? So actually, they're not believing in anymore in the institutions of the Western European EU institutions. That's why it's also in a crisis, as you mentioned. And it's not going to stand, nor will Greece stand for it, the youth of Greece, nor will the youth of the Balkans, nor will the youth of many European countries stand for it. It's just a time question, that how long will it take for the older generations to release the power, right? So the older generations
and then what?
And then the younger generations will actually probably move towards a much more common ground for European nations. I just say that only to say that if Greece has a debt with the EU, all the statues in the Metropolitan, in the British Museum, all the frieze of the Parthenon would pay for all of that debt.
And then the Greeks will have the opportunity to create new debt.
I don't think there'll be a new generation. It'll be smarter. You might be right.
The problem is not to get rid of the debt, is to get rid of the tendency to create debt.
Well, no, I think we'll never be able to, right? That because it's millennium, it's trading, right? We come from camel traders, right? But the point here is
the generation of the millennium will sooner or later.
Millenniums are not going to go anymore for the ironies
until the time that they hit on the wall of geopolitics.
Of geopolitics,
and then they will change the mind, or their children will change mind.
Correct. We're going to go through into a confrontation of geopolitics, a generational conflict.
Exactly. Sure. But we are entering into a very dangerous period. There is no doubt about that.
Thank you very much. My name is Daphne, and Daphne in Greek. I'm from Turkey, though, but I have very, very little Greek origins as well. Like one of my grandparents is from Greece. I wonder what would a possible rapprochement between Turkey and Greece would actually bring to this idealized post-Westphalia world. And right now, given that Greece is in the European Union, while Turkey is the big other of the European Union, to what extent such a rapprochement would be possible?
You know, I'm afraid the answer is, depends how Turkey will evolve. What is going to be Turkey in 5 years? This is the big problem. In order to discuss about the relationship between Greece and Turkey, you have to know, of course, how Greece will be in 5 years, but also how Turkey is going to be in 5 years. And I think that about Turkey there are more questions than about Greece. Otherwise, it's possible to create various scenarios. And of course, if you like, this feeling that we are under the pressure of big forces of globalization would lead, obviously, to the idea that people with similar cultures should get together and work together. Reconstruct the Ottoman Empire, it's an old debate. But at the same time, I think that in Turkey, the cultural differences are becoming stronger and stronger. There is a part of Turkey which could very easily come very close to Greece because the culture is practically the same. I mean, near the sea, in the big cities, etc., there is no cultural divide. But then I think that there is more difference between Turks in Istanbul there is more difference between Turks in Istanbul and in Izmir and the inside than between those Turks and the Greeks. So it's difficult to predict. I think we are getting into a very unstable period, and we should hope for as much working together as possible. But at the same time, we have to be realistic and realize that there are a lot of difficulties. I'm worried. I'm worried about, as you understand, I'm worried about Greece. I'm worried about Turkey as well. But anyway, at least in diaspora, Greeks and Turks are working very well together.
Okay, so thank you so much. Is there a question? Yes, of course.
So, to be very brief, I just wanted to ask you a bit about the methodological stakes in using the language of the history of peoples and of nations as a mode of critiquing a Westphalian order that, as you rightly say, has failed, that people don't trust, but which was founded on the same language of the history and the law of nations and peoples. So I'm just really interested in that choice that you've made and why you made it.
Well, the problem is that we are speaking with a Eurocentric language and we are trying to speak about things other than Eurocentric. We are prisoners of our language, and what we are trying to do is somehow to push the limits as much as possible. This means that we have to take risks, methodological risks. We have to use new concepts and ideas that can be criticized by our colleagues. Personally, I do take them. I'm old enough not to be afraid to be criticized. But it is a big problem. We are under Eurocentric hegemony. Maybe anthropologists can help us a lot. You have been discussing this problem all the time. But we are doing what we can. There's nothing else.
I'm surprised that you should say that.
The what?
That Germany weighs heavy on Greece's fate. Obviously.
When? In the 19th century or today?
No, now.
But I didn't say that. Did I say that?
Sorry, then I misunderstood.
Because of the method of the Eurocentric ways of.
Yes, but
no, it's not German. It's European.
Yeah,
the tradition of the Renaissance.
But Europeans disagree terribly.
Yes, but still they have a certain vision, and if you come from another culture, somehow you feel that this vision is a kind of box in which it's difficult to put your own experiences. But this, you have to be inside the culture in order to understand it.
I don't know. I think Athens is an exceptionally European city, and it doesn't suffer from any.
Have you listened to Rebetika, for example, in Athens?
Yes, but it's totally European. What's the? I mean, if you go to Lisbon or Porto, you will hear music from Cabo Verde or from Angola, and that's Europe as well.
You know,
I think you're being very Eurocentric yourself in sort of legitimizing.
I am Eurocentric because I have studied.
That are maybe not that here.
I have studied in an American high school. I studied in France, so I know that I'm Eurocentric. I know that when I was an urban planner, I had visions and ideas that were part of this kind of projection of European models into another reality. I tried to criticize myself and, if possible, to develop kind of sensitivity to something else. I'm sure that I didn't do it enough, but I'm aware of that. But as I said, we are not perfect. We are doing what we can. We try to stretch a bit the limits of our understanding, and we are aware that life is too short in order to attain something more or less perfect.
So with these very wise words, I want to thank once more Georges Prevelakis for this excellent talk tonight. And thank you all for participating, being part of this first co-organized event between the Albert Hirschman Center for Democracy and the Fondation Braillard Architectes, which I hope will open to a series of discussions and themes that we may propose to our publics. Well, thank you so much for being here tonight, and see you again. Thank you so much. Oui, il est resté.